We probably could still do this podcast from jail, right?
Hi, I'm Andy,
And I'm Roger,
and welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics.
on our search to find the middle.
That's fatphobic.
I don't build wall. I just own halfway to Siwa.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
I act as if God exists.
Put your masks on.
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams, my childhood, with your empty words.
Hey, you've got one of those ice machines, right?
So that was a one of those purchases that you think is a good idea at the time, and you've used it once.
Oh, really? Because I was going to ask whether you recommend it, because I've bought one of those massive Stanley cups. Have you? Are you familiar?
This isn't like the Yeti phenomenon, is it?
There's a specific Stanley cup that's really popular. It's trendy with the yummy mummies. And basically it's this huge, oversized 40-ounce thermos with a handle and a straw. And I got one for Christmas. And I mean, obviously you fill it with ice and it stays cold for like all day. But it takes a lot of ice. So I was thinking, man, I wish I had one of those ice makers that Andy has. I wonder if it works.
It's just one of those things that sounds cool, and you just want to buy it just out of curiosity, just to, does it actually work? Does it? And like you have visions of, I don't know if you've ever worked in like hospitality or you've been exposed to the commercial grade ones, and they're these big things, and they get this big, almost like a bucket to scoop out the ice, and you, oh yeah, that'd be like so
It's
cool.
not like that?
No, it's just like it just spits out these like little pellets of ice, and they melt sort of before you even get the chance to take them out.
Because ice is like a real luxury for me now that I'm older. You know, I've been making, cold brew, iced coffees and different things like that. I mean, one day I would like to be able to do an ice sculpture for an event. That would be amazing. You laugh, but you know that I will gain the requisite skills to make my own ice carving.
There's very few of the people that I associate with that would ever admit to aspiring to want to do that, and you're one of them.
All right, well, let's cut straight to the chase here, Andy. So we left a few episodes ago talking about Christmas. You know, you mentioned that your family asked you to bring 2 prepackaged Aldi Caesar salads with the rip-off lids. Now, I know you didn't do that, I'm hoping. I've been dying of anticipation. Tell me what went down.
Well, instead of going to Aldi, I went to Woolworths and bought 2 prepackaged Caesar salads.
Did they have like the croutons packed separately so they wouldn't go soggy?
They had a little bit more bacon. No prepackaged Caesar salad this Christmas. So we brought 2 things. Our family, we brought a salad, which was made homemade, not a supermarket salad, and made an apple crumble.
Traditional. I like it. And so did they graciously put your salad to the side, or was it on the table? Did it make the table?
No, look, to be fair, it was fairly like Christmas kind of catering was fairly. Look, I mean, I've seen what you're up to. I mean, you've got a bit of like Clark Griswold going on with your catering, but with our Christmas affair was just fairly simple. No turkey, store-bought chickens, probably a ham that was store-bought, all relatively easy, a couple of salads, some prawns, that kind of stuff. But no, like, over-the-top cooking. In hindsight, I can kind of, as belittling as the Aldi Caesar salads sound, it was within the spirit of the day to be just like everyone went easy kind of thing.
Yeah, okay, all right. So it wasn't so much that they expected like that little of you. It kind of was the vibe of being relaxed.
I mean, this is the thing. Like, I think in my mind, like chopping up some salad ingredients and making like apple crumble is probably one of the easiest sort of desserts. These are the easiest of the things you can do, right? So that's my kind of low effort. But yeah.
When I went to get the seafood this year, I decided to go really late at night. And I think I went at about almost 11 o'clock at night. And I thought, oh, surely no lunatic is going to be like me and try to get their seafood that late.
Is this, Christmas Eve?
Yeah, this is me trying to get it on the 23rd for the 24th. So I'm getting it the day before because my duties are on Christmas Eve in terms of my catering and hosting. and my sister was
okay.
hosting on the day itself.
Oh God, that's full on. So you do both Christmas Eve and Christmas Day.
Yeah, all our relatives literally hopped in the car and drove all the way from Melbourne. That's like a 10-hour drive. So we're going to have to do, we had 3 days worth of activities.
So how do you, that's full on. So both Christmas Eve and Christmas Day.
Yeah, and actually we did Christmas,
you
we
get
did the
sick of each other
23rd as
by
well. So we did a barbecue on the 23rd, and then we had yum cha on the Christmas Eve for brunch, and then I hosted the 24th, and then my sister put on both breakfast and Christmas lunch on the day.
What was breakfast? Was it like here's a big box of Special K?
Think again.
Eat your heart
Think
out.
again. It was like full English breakfast. It was crazy. Anyway, so on the 23rd, I thought, I'll go. I'll avoid actually doing it on Christmas Eve. I'll beat the crowds, right? So 11 p.m. at night, I rock up into the car park. I'm like, oh, this is feeling pretty good. The car park's not very full. And then I get in there, and it is like a military operation. They've constructed 3 waiting bays, A, B, C, right? And each of those waiting bays has like a guy with a red velvet rope and security. And they've got the Secret Service earpieces in. And so they're like communicating with each other when they can let people come from one section to another. And I'm all the way back in C. And it's a 45-minute wait to get this, to get my seafood.
Where are you buying your prawns from?
Costies. They are the best, but it's like crazy. There's this 45-minute wait, 11 p.m. at night, and there are kids in there. Like there was a kid that looked like they were, 1 year old, just crying in a trolley at like 11 p.m. trying to get their prawns.
Okay, so I don't have first-hand experience with the prawns, but we had prawns on Christmas Day. My mum went and did the prawn shopping, and the story she explained. Now, I should say that these prawns were perfectly fine. They tasted good. They were good size. They were fresh. Whatever attributes that you would say are favourable for a prawn.
Yeah.
The story she relayed was that she went into the shop and she didn't pre-book or anything like that, because last year when she went to get them and she pre-booked, and she just saw all these people rocking up to the counter and just buying them straight away, and they didn't have to wait as long. And so she just rocked up, got her prawns, went, and all done. Nice and easy. So where I'm going here is like, I sense that you're chasing perfection like a little bit here. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, like obviously your mum's involved in the story, so I'm not going to make any assumptions on where she got her prawns. But for example,
Or from like a seafood place, like not like the frozen prawns from Coles or something.
not that there's anything wrong with that.
Or the prepackaged ones.
But look, so Costies has like I guess they have, a dedicated bay at the fish market, right? So they have like that kind of vibe to it. And I guess it's not just about the prawns. So yes, they have like the real jumbo prawns, the ones that are like, literally take up your whole palm. But they also have other things that we needed. So for example, one of the dishes was a whole side of salmon. So it was like a whole fillet, like the tail, including the tail. And so, they kind of like have the ability to source those ones. And then, I needed a certain type of raw prawn for some of the Asian dishes. So yes, they're kind of like the best in terms of getting the biggest prawns, but also they do specialty dishes like in the way a butcher would for like a rack of ribs or something, So, but hey, I'm not the only one chasing perfection. There's like, I'm in a line with all sorts of people, right? Like I'm not sitting in their line with, David Jones, highfalutin people. Like, they were bogans in the line with me. We did go a bit over the top. Because obviously I put on a big Asian spread for Christmas Eve, and then my sister did the traditional Christmas, which involved all the usual suspects. But it was a big feast, and it went down really well. There was like deep frying going. There's a bunch of stuff going on.
See, I was actually going to remark that I sense there's a bit of a unstable equilibrium going on in your like family dynamic, in that you've got the Christmas Eve and the Christmas Day like gathering,
Yeah.
and I presume that the person who hosts Christmas Eve is not also hosting Christmas Day.
Yeah, it's like a shared thing. Yeah.
So you have this this like competition, right? So the Christmas Eve one can't outperform the Christmas Day one. So everyone has like, you have to keep lifting, but then if you're doing the Christmas Eve one, you almost like, maybe not deliberately, but there's this like, you want to, that's your hosting thing, so you want to make the most of it. So it just creates this, and you got to step up. You got to like match the Christmas Day one, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, we were aware of that dynamic, right? And I'm actually naturally not a very competitive person. So what we did to kind of make sure that I didn't steal any of my sister's thunder was that we made Christmas Eve a totally different cuisine. So it was no Christmas food. It was only like Asian food. And it was so anything that happened there was just like a nice Asian meal. It couldn't be like, I couldn't bust out the ham or like the turkey or anything like that. It had to be a totally different thing.
But you wouldn't want to have that 2 days in a row anyway.
Yeah, you know what I mean. But so that's kind of how we tried to manage it. But it was still a little bit over the top, if I'm totally honest. That week, every night I was making a dish, and then it all came together in a crazy frenzy. But anyway, it's all good.
Does using like a honey soy sauce glaze on the ham count as Asian? Or
there's a little bit of Asian in all of us. So whenever, I don't know whether you get this, but whenever we have Christmas Day lunch, there's always someone that says some version of this phrase, which is like, I wonder what the poor people are doing right now, right? Like, it's just like a funny boomer thing to say. And it does make me think, though, like everyone is having some version of Christmas lunch or dinner or something like that, right? On the day, it's a public holiday. And do you often wonder, like, what they're doing in prisons?
Well, I do want to come back to the prison question, but before we do, I want to touch on the lyrics of one of my favorite Christmas songs, which I think is relevant to your question, which is, do they know it's Christmas time, or do they know it's Christmas rather? This is the Band-Aid one with like all the celebrities and stuff. And the premise of the song is, do they know it's Christmas in Africa, right? So do the poor people, who most likely aren't Christian, do they know it's Christmas, because it's such a horrible place that they live in, right? And I just some wonderful pieces of wisdom. So this from Bono, well, tonight, thank God it's them instead of you. And then Boy George and others chime in, and there won't be snow in Africa this Christmas time. And the greatest gift they'll get this year is life. Ooh, where nothing ever grows, no rain or rivers flow. Do they know it's Christmas time at all?
Really? No rivers? I think David Attenborough would dispute that one.
Paul Young, underneath that burning sun, and then all finishing off, feed the world. So, okay. So back to your prison question. What are they having? They must have something like surely they wouldn't get served up like gruel, like just like here's your everyday.
I guarantee that what they're eating in prison would be better than some of the stuff they serve in schools.
Well, it'll all be nutritious. I'll tell you what, it would be better than. It would be better than the food they serve you in hospital.
Oh,
that takes the cake.
Definitely. Unless somehow they have the same contractors and it's actually just the same.
The irony is they probably don't have the same contractors and they've got like much more.
It's like, just one big shell corporation with Neil Perry at the head. It's Qantas. One goes to Qantas.
Luke Mangan's is pretty out. Maybe then like a hypothetical, rather than like us pontificate about what might be the case. How about we address what should be the case? Like what level of, like celebration do you think is fair and reasonable in a prison, like on Christmas?
Yeah, like in the last episode, I talked about how important, is Christmas cancelled this year? My stance was it's an important part of like mental relief and hope for the following year to give you the energy to go on. I feel as if for that one day a year, they should be almost like feel like they're let out of jail and they should be able to like experience what I would say is a normal day without the crushing oppression of and loss of freedom that they usually feel. And so however that could be manufactured without physically letting them free into the community, I would be totally supportive of that, even if that day cost an inmate like, 5 times as much as a normal day would cost.
Isn't the whole point of prison not to give them hope?
Well, I think if you...
Like, isn't that like part of the punishment? It's like they can't let you out on your birthday, for example. Like it's got to be, no, you're in jail because you're missing out on all of these things. And no, you don't get to celebrate Christmas. You just get to, we'll give you your tray of slop and go to bed at 6 or whenever 7.
Yeah, but there's 364 days for that to happen. This is just one day. And one day that would hopefully help. If, it's really about reform and rehabilitation, then this will give them a bit of a shot in the arm to actually, come to the table with that.
Okay. Well, let's do that, right? This is a conversation about what prisons ought to be, right? So I think where there's a divergence is that we know what prisons are, right? In most, not all countries, but like, and there's all actually quite a lot of difference between countries, I think, but at least like notionally, it is a place where you're punished. Like it is about punishment. It's about, taking your liberty away for you because you did something wrong, right?
Yeah.
And I guess there's a very interesting sort of debate about like what's the usefulness of that? Like what's the utility to us as a society of almost like, sticking the dagger in and then twisting it kind of thing?
Yeah, look, I think I understand the different takes on the approach of this, right? But would you agree that largely in Australia, it's very much seen as like a rehabilitation
No.
is still the focus of what most people think the focus is of jail, right?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that is the case in Australia. I think if that were genuinely the case, then prison would be a lot more like drug rehab or AA kind of sort of thing, right? It wouldn't be this cold, depressing place where, you can't see anyone and you're locked away.
But I think a lot of public institutions are cold, depressing places, but that doesn't mean that that's the intent, right? Like I think
prisons are particularly
but
cold
okay,
and depressing. Like,
you could still have cold and depressing conditions and the overall tone, but still, like I think that when you peel back most of these institutions, there still would be attempts, like giving, like offering social work and social services and the access to educational courses and reading and all these kind of other, and therapy, some form of therapy. Like now, it might not be the quality that you'd get as in on the outside, but there would be those options, however ineffective. Just as some of these options and services are ineffective in public schools, for example.
To tackle this question, if we maybe think of it the other way around, as in like if you were to optimally design an institution for purely rehabilitation, how would you design it? And you basically, there's probably two types of prisoners, right, that we send to institution like jail, right? There's people who need to be locked away and they need to be kept away from everyone else because they're actually a danger to the rest of society if they're let out. So, like let's say serial murderers or something like that.
Violent
serial
offenders.
Killers or rapists or whatever. And there's like a very strong argument for them to be locked away, their liberty to be deprived, not so much as a punishment, but more as a, like, to protect the rest of society, right? And, there's that as a cohort is probably the minority of prisoners, but let's just say that they represent 50% of the prison population. But then there's this other percentage of this other 50%, and it's probably much higher than that, where they might be in there for petty crime, or they might be in there for, they might be very remorseful. It might have been, what if it's like someone who drove a car and, accidentally, they like manslaughter, they're in jail for manslaughter or something like that, right? These kinds of prisoners, there's not really any chance of them reoffending. That's not really a concern, or either that or the severity of the risk is like, okay, well, someone in jail for the risk, that's probably not serious enough to withhold their liberty or whatever. So for that cohort of the population, at least, the prison system is not like the best way to kind of rehabilitate, right? Most of the prison system in its current form is like, it's the legacy of what it used to be, and it's slow changing and it's not really evolving. And part of the reason it's not evolving is because the public wouldn't allow for it. So if, let's say, a progressive government wanted to rethink the way it did corrections and rehabilitation, it said, okay, we're going to, what we're actually going to do is we're going to take them out to this, like this really nice location, like maybe almost resort style, and we're going to work on them. We're going to give them close one-on-one support. It's going to be a bit more like a holiday than, that wouldn't fly, right? So it has to be this brutal, tough thing. And if it's not, then the public, all the talkback radio hosts like get all antsy about it, and so it doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
So they have to keep.
All right, well,
yeah.
I see what you're saying. So maybe I can kind of, when I ask that question, I suppose the question being, do most Australians believe in a more rehabilitation focused tone of jail here in the country and going to prison? I guess what I'm thinking in my head, just to kind of paint you the ends of the scale so that we can have a talk about that, is that like the stereotypical USA model, right, in America, where is very much like based on retributive justice, right? This idea that people deserve to be punished, and long prison sentences, and even the death penalty in particular in some states, that is justified and is a manifestation of that philosophy, that actually there needs to be some kind of retribution for crimes that have occurred. And then they also base it on deterrence, where they're like the tough on crime. The DAs get voted in because they're tough on crime. So it becomes this arm race of using mandatory minimum sentences and stuff like that. So that's and also the way that incarceration, the conditions of the jails is actually part of that as well. So those like three things play out really well in America, and the philosophy there, right? So that's one end of the scale where they're like very much focused on that, right? They put bad people away, it's a deterrence, and it should be painful, and they need to have their just desserts, right? And then you look at like the Scandinavian side on the other end of the scale, right? And they have much more of a true rehabilitation focus, right? So all the things that I spoke about, vocational training, therapy, educational programs, that kind of thing. They believe in restorative justice, which is like, how do we actually fix what's happened, right? So, and that could be things like mediation between victim and offender and stuff like that. And this idea of like, you must make right for it, not just pay time that's not connected to your victim. And they also have this idea that in Scandinavia that the prisons must mimic everyday life, because if you don't, then they will never be able to come out and join society. So if those are the two ends of the scales, don't you think Australia fits in the middle?
Well, we do fit in the middle, but I guess if the question is which of those two models reflects an outlook that doesn't focus on punishment, like in over rehabilitation, then the Scandinavian end of the spectrum is the one that you should be adopting, right? If you are genuinely of the view that punishing people for things just for shits and giggles, right? Let's be a bit more concrete than that, like to make victims feel better, because that's really what it's about, right? Like it really is, and victim maybe broadly conceived, we might consider, literally the victim, but we might also think of their family, their friends, their wider community and so on. But if at the end of the day, all you care about is, are we essentially going to stop this from happening again? Then there's really only two things that you should concern yourself with. One is the punishment going to be a strong enough disincentive for people of that kind to commit that offense in the future? So not necessarily the individual who you're punishing, but other people in the future. So is it a deterrent?
Yeah.
And then the second of all, like, is the actual time in prison itself, is it effective at either rehabilitating that person so they don't reoffend, or perhaps they don't even need rehabilitating because maybe it's just there was just a one-off, like there's no reason to think that thing would happen again, whatever they've done, or do we need to deprive them of their liberties to protect the broader community? So I think the Scandinavian model is probably the one that does that. But I think you mentioned all those factors in America, like DAs and just this general like attitude. We've got some of those factors here too. Like it's not as extreme, but like we definitely have an expectation that we have tough on crime. Like we have mandatory minimum sentencing as well. So, there's lots of things going on, right? It's not as extreme as the US, but we have that too.
So, Andy, I think we can kind of like dance around this issue a little bit, but I think what underpins the theory and whether you believe what end of the scale you're on, whether you realize it or not, is probably like your attitude towards free will, right? Because I think, and we have talked about this previously, that the legal system kind of breaks down when you start to question this idea of free will, or a case maybe against free will as it's an agency as it's kind of known, So I think maybe we should have a chat about that, because I think that underlying all of this is this idea that people have free will and have agency and are in control of their actions. Therefore, when they do something wrong, when they commit a crime, that they are totally responsible for that. Yeah. So, I mean, do you have a stance on this?
Well, anyone who has a spare hour or so, go onto Netflix and watch Ricky Gervais's latest Armageddon special. And I think one of his opening jokes, something to the effect of, you don't control the thought that comes into your mind, right? So you can't be upset at someone for thinking something, right? And that's the sort of the concept here with free will, right? So the only difference between like eventually, it doesn't matter how far back, but eventually you can come up with a factor that was outside of the person's control that accounts for them doing the thing that they've done. So let's just give an example. So I have a loaded pistol in my hand and I'm shooting it at, I've got it pointed at another person. And at that point in time, yes, I've put my hand on the gun, I've lifted it, I've pointed at the person. There's plenty of actual decisions I've made. Yes, I've decided to pull the trigger and then, end up killing the other person. So it's black and white, like, I don't know, what would you call that? First degree murder, right? There's no accident about it. It's very premeditated. There's no...
Are you describing the Alec Baldwin case?
Well, we could go to that one, but no, slightly different, this one. So, I mean, like, yes, that on the face of it, like to bring up like a conversation about like, well, free will, like of course that person has free will to, they made that choice and they should be punished for it, right? But you can go back before that date and you can ask questions like, okay, well, what did the other person do? Maybe that other person had a gun in their hand and that was pointed at that person. Okay, maybe not. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's that person's a drug addict and they're robbing for money. Okay, well, is it really the fault of the person that they're a drug addict? Maybe they're like a crack baby and they were like, they were addicted to ice before they were even born, right?
So the ice maker does work.
It just crystal blue. The blue, you add a bit of blue water. It looks.
That'd be a nice touch.
But I guess with the concept of free will, right? Like, there's a lot of people who, well, to say they don't know better, kind of is probably a bit patronizing. But if you look in the standard like profile of the prison population, I'm pretty sure, like, it's fairly common that there's a lot of disadvantage in upbringing. There's a lot of people who had really bad role models. So in the context of free will, like, you've got to ask, they didn't control the circumstances that led them up to that point, right? So to punish them for making some of those really bad choices and decisions purely to punish them, through the lens that we don't have free will, is unfair, except to the extent that you need to have those punishments for people to make better decisions. So you absolutely do need punishments, because if you don't have punishments, then those will then have no reason to, like, moderate their behavior and act in a kind of a socialized way, right?
Yeah.
So you definitely need punishments for that reason.
You've broken it down nicely, but I'm just keen on getting your personal view on where you sit on the free will spectrum, right? Because there's some people that are very, very strong on they're just like, free will is not a thing, and thoughts kind of come out of a cloud of consciousness and that's all there is. There's nothing external to the thought, and therefore you can't really hold anyone accountable for what they're doing, right? And there are others that are much more, no, we have agency. Yes, into your example, you can't control what thought you think of, but you can control the action that you do with that thought. And so I just want to get your opinion on where you sit on that.
I think when it boils down to it, there is no such thing as free will. I think free will is mostly an illusion. Like, the notion that we control ourselves and everything we do is an illusion. But equally, that's not the same thing as saying that we don't respond to external kind of constraints. So,
all right, so you kind of entertain that while free will does not exist, that there are moments of agency in the right context.
Well, it's not so much that we have agency. It's just that the notion of agency is an illusion, right? The person that would pull the trigger in one state of the universe where there's no punishment for pulling the trigger can be exactly the same as the person in another alternate universe. But if there's a rule saying, and an associated punishment saying that if you pull that trigger, you'll go to jail, then that person will not pull the trigger. But the reason that person in that, the two alternate universes is, reacting differently is because they're responding to the different environment that they're in. One world where they get punished for it and the other where they don't. But that's different to free will. That's not us deciding. It's our brain consciously altering the way we behave in the circumstances.
Yeah. It's obviously a very interesting area, right? And there's obviously a very famous set of experiments that tries to measure brain neuron activity And I won't go through it. You can look it up. There's a few of them that have been repeated. But essentially, the conclusion is that when you make a decision and you're strapped up to different devices that try to detect brain activity, they seem to indicate that the area of the brain that makes the decision fires before the rationalization of that decision. So indicating at like maybe at a neural level that you never really make a decision. It's just like the decision arrives and then you rationalize it afterwards. And every decision you've ever made is comprised of that order, which is totally the opposite of what we think. We would think that logically, we weigh up the options and then we come to the conclusion. But it's kind of the other way around. We just randomly offered up a solution or decision from our brain, and then we try to rationalize it, try to understand that decision later. Now, sometimes you can see that happening in real time, and other times it's less clear. I don't know, though. Even with all that armchair philosophy, the idea that the day-to-day mechanics of whether you can make good choices or bad choices, and indeed whether you need to live with them, whether you need to be responsible for them, I don't think I'm totally over line with. While I do understand the arguments around this idea of free will and the idea of how thoughts work and how consciousness, I suppose, plays a role in this, everything breaks down without it. If you take it to its logical conclusion, it is a very, very challenging message, that actually, not only because of people's circumstance, but because of the way that we work cognitively, even, that no one is truly responsible for their actions,
Yeah, I mean, so some of those experiments are interesting, but I do think like some of the like discussion about free will kind of relying on those, like I think misses the point a little bit, or at least they're not like the most compelling.
Yeah. It's an apologetic way of trying to convince people. It's like, let's go to the science, take it away from the philosophy, and actually, I can show you at a scientific level that the cart is before the horse.
Well, I think probably the more compelling thing to consider isn't so much like at a neurological level, like when does the signal get sent down? Like the point is more that the signal gets sent down in the first place. Like what are the circumstances that person is in such that the signal to fire we're talking about a weapon here, but it could be anything, right? Because those settings and those factors are not really truly within the control of the person. So whether it's their upbringing, whether it's that they've got a form of brain damage or they didn't develop properly, or even that they had access to a gun in the first place, or there's all these things that are not really truly within their control. So I think the punishment side, let's just say of a 10-year sentence, right? Let's just say the minimum or the optimal number of years for like a prison sentence to discourage, like let's say you do the statistical analysis on it and you come up with some figure like, the optimum number of years to discourage, murders or something, right? People from firing guns is like, I don't know, 3 years or something, right? And then you go, okay, well, 3 years, that's the optimal, right? Because we've got to consider the costs of having people in jail for 30 years, right? That's a cost to the taxpayer. It's a cost to the livelihood of the person who's committed the offense. Like that's a big chunk of their life gone. There's actually all these costs you've actually got to consider. So let's say you run the calculus on it and you work out the optimum's 3 years, right, to discourage and so on. And you go, okay, well, 3 years, but actually it needs to be more like 15 years, right? Because 3 years is too short. So like 15 years for murder, so we've got to have this extra 12 years that's just purely to meet some kind of mob, the mob sense of justice, right? It's not really an optimum. It's just and so that extra 12 years in this example, just to satisfy a sense of like a notion of justice, is purely just to punish the person. It's not to stop them from doing it in the first place. It's just to punish them. Like it's to, make sure we turn that dagger like a few times and then rub salt in the wounds and all that sort of stuff. And all that stuff's like the part that I think we're talking about here. It's not the first 3 years that you need to discourage the offense and to protect the community. It's all the extra stuff that just like makes people feel good. That sort of sense of, yes, we've really made this person suffer, like the Game of Thrones style walk of shame, And that's the bit where I think this conversation of free will comes into play, because you can say, well, maybe if that person fully controlled every single factor that led up to them, you could sort of say, all right, well, yeah, there is this sense of like justice to get them the full 15 years. But if you start saying, yeah, but there's all these reasons that explain why this person is the way they are, and they're like less fortunate than you or the average person, that's such that like, maybe we don't want to turn that dagger quite as much as we're accustomed to.
Yeah. I mean, I heard this really good analogy about it, right? Like, it's kind of, if you believe in some of the things that we're talking about, this lack of free will, and it's about the conditions, and we don't have as much agency as we think, not nearly as much. It's like this idea of like a car and a car malfunctioning on the road and swerving into a lane and killing someone, right? So, okay, so what you need to do straight away is take that car off the road because it's a danger to pedestrians and other drivers and the driver themselves. And what you don't do, though, is every time it's off the road in the garage, come into the garage every morning and like beat it with a baseball bat, right? It's kind of taken off the road for its protection while the mechanic works out what the malfunction is. And I think that was like a really good analogy around this idea of like punishment, the added extra bit that you're talking about, right? It's like the car is already off the road. You know, it's not where it wants to be. And then this whole idea of rehabilitation or treatment is the second part. Is like, are we really trying to find out what's wrong with the malfunction? Or are we just kind of getting it ready to, or are we just happy that it's off the road? So I think that to me is like part of it, because most people look at rehabilitation and stuff like that and they see the recurrence rates and the reoffense rates, and they're so high. You know, like even in Australia, just taking like, it's somewhere around 50% within 2 years out of the total prison population. So people sitting there going, well, rehabilitation's not working. All these people are just lost causes, right? And a lot of those people, unfortunately, for petty crime that you spoke about in that population, they're not the serious offenders that are in there for longer terms anyway. So they're kind of thinking from all of that, it's like the general public just sits back and goes, as a community member, your rehabilitation's not working and they're reoffending. Half of them are reoffending within 2 years. So really, you're just not keeping them in long enough. You know, there's not that deterrent because they're going in and out.
I think the other analogy that is, you know, there's two other analogies related to one. It's like being upset with thunderstorms because, you know,
trying to imprison a hurricane.
Like, you know, it's sort of like, well, shit happens. So, you know, if we kind of treat the kind of people we're talking about who just have like, are almost like destined to become, you know, committing crime just by virtue of the circumstances they're in, their personality and all those sorts of, like, it is what it is. There's no point. You do what you can to mitigate it, but there's no point getting upset about it. But the other one, using your car analogy, is, so let's say someone drives a car, they are speeding, they hit either another, they cause a crash, they lose control, they hit another car and someone dies or whatever, and you go, okay, well, yeah, actually speeding was the contributing factor here, and so if that person wasn't speeding, then that wouldn't have happened, therefore they should be punished. But the thing you don't go and do is you don't go and put everyone who's speeding in jail that didn't cause an accident. It's only when they do cause an, like, so it's only by virtue of, like, it's like a lottery that whether you're just the unlucky person. So in that situation, unless you're kind of willing to have this standard, this really high bar of a standard that everyone who speeds should be in jail as though they killed someone, which we don't, because everyone thinks speeding's okay over, you know, within a 10 k's an hour or whatever. Yeah. Then in that case, there's to hold this view that someone needs to go to jail because they killed someone because they were speeding isn't really tenable. And of course that's easy to say when you don't know a victim or you're not related to a victim or whatever. But that's not necessarily the best place to be considering these sorts of questions from.
It's also like, you know, they always say that for a crime to occur, there has to be a victim, right? And we know that that's obviously not always the case, but that comes from the legal system, right? And while it's not perfect, far from perfect, that's the, you know, system of law and justice that we have. And I'd be keen on touching on that with you, actually. First of all, I'll kind of take it from this point of view. In our lifetime, so probably in the last, 10, 12 years, I've seen just this fascination of true crime, and specifically around court cases and wrongful convictions. What do you think explains that?
Well, great editing and storytelling.
Serial podcast.
It's the fact that it's real, right? It's an extension of like reality TV, and like I don't know if you've I know that we talked about Squid Game, that you haven't seen the new reality version of it,
No.
but like that it's real, the drama.
Do they use all
it's-
Koreans or?
No, it's they've got like a cast from around the world, albeit not from Asian countries, predominantly from English speaking countries. But like it's the fact that it's real and only just like if it was just a drama, it wouldn't be interesting, right? It would just be another episode of Law and Order, and it'd be very forgettable. But that it's real only means it's just, oh, this is actually real. This actually happened. And sometimes it's like more extreme and more wild than you could come up with in a writing room. But I think the power of editing is so profound because like they tell the story from the perspective of, they ultimately want to give that effect to the audience, this sense of like, wow, and like intrigue, and every episode ends on a cliffhanger, and it's all strung together such that there can actually be legit like a murderer who very much likely, there's no doubt about their innocence, who they can have the audience rooting for, and they can flip the script like entirely 180 degrees. It can be the prosecution and the police being the bad guys, right? It can even be the victims and their family being, they just think this guy's guilty, and they're like, going after him in this really unfair way. And people, because, we when we're watching a story in front of us, we check our brains at the door, and we just like, yep, give it to me. And I think we enjoy it. We enjoy that experience.
So you don't think it's, I totally get you with the power of editing and how it's kind of brought through this idea of like a personal narrative, right? And giving a hallmark, I think, of the era has been very much like focusing on individual narratives rather than a story as a whole. That to the nth degree, sometimes that becomes quite tiring when you consume too much of it, for me personally. But you don't think there's something special about this specific thing around wrongful accusations, wrongful kind of convictions, or is it just another kind of Agatha Christie whodunit? And the part of it is just you just don't know in the end, and this idea that you can never know.
The ones that in my mind, like if you ask me which ones I remember from the last say 5-10 years, it's probably the two are like Making a Murderer and The Staircase, right? And they're both the same kind of premise, right? Someone's in jail, and then like it's their story, right? And for murder, right? And I think, I don't, obviously we can't know, but like in both cases, well, okay, to begin with Making a Murderer, that was just so well put together. The first season, the second season, and third seasons were a little bit sort of just kind of flogging a dead horse, but that first season was just amazing, right? And it was just like, oh, like it.
At the time of watching that series, Making a Murderer, I had never seen anything like that. Like it was literally,
it was just so wild, right? Seeing like the police and their tactics and or more or less their incompetence, right?
Yeah.
And with The Staircase, I think what made that so special was that it was this multi-year saga, and it was like the guy was almost, and the fact that he wasn't in jail for the majority of it, but then he was in jail, and then he got, or without any spoilers, but like just the saga of it. But again, just that you don't know, and they're, yes, you can never know, right? That's implicit in it. But I think nonetheless, like the aspiration for most people watching it, like I think the motivation, like the reason they want to keep coming back for more isn't necessarily the outcome. They just want to know what's the next twist, right? What's the next? I don't necessarily know people are rooting for like the villain or whatever, although I think they have to be to kind of have buy into it to some extent. But like they, I think they get framed as like these, oh, you won't believe what happens next. Like you won't like, and that's, everyone just wants that next, like, do you know, it was actually an owl that did,
But there also is nothing like injustice to get your blood boiling, right? And when you see it in front of you and you have this realization, I think it's actually The Staircase that used this line. I'll say it verbatim, but it's pretty much this idea that you can say to yourself that in your lifetime, you will never perpetrate a crime, but you cannot say that no one will ever accuse you of a crime. And it's like that dawning that it's like, this is voyeuristic. You're looking at this life fall apart. And God forbid they are innocent and have gone through all of this. But then the second thought is, well, actually, this could happen to you under the right circumstance. And it just kind of this idea that we are living with an imperfect system of justice. And there are many people who have come foul of that, right? And just like you said, sometimes you can never know, but someone has to go to jail. You know what I mean? Like someone has to pay for the crime. And a jury of your peers will decide that at the end of the day, right? And like the gravity of what happens, these decisions and the impact they have on the rest of your life is just these 12 people and the lawyers that are working within the system, a millimeter within the system to get a result for their client. It actually is astounding for a layperson to see how it all happens.
I'm interested in your views of like the concept of like in our legal system, like beyond reasonable doubt, right? Because I mean, that gives a lot of leeway for someone to get off, right? In fact, like I'm often surprised as you know, not someone who knows that much about this, you know, how these things, the criminal justice system in the more technical sense, but where like you might have, let's say, a he said, she said situation, let's say in a sexual assault case or something like that. And you just think, well, surely that means that there's enough reasonable doubt. Like if it just comes down to what they say happened on the night, that's such that you by default virtually can never get a conviction, but they do get convictions and they look at other evidence. But in the context of like let's say a murder, unless you've got like physical evidence, and I mean it's hard to imagine based on, you know, my long extensive experience having watched true crime, it's like unthinkable that anyone could go to jail in the absence of physical evidence. Like, and it's and then even then you can explain away some physical evidence. Like,
I mean, look at just look at the circus around the OJ case and this how
yeah, but the glove didn't fit. Okay.
He was wearing the rubber gloves, but just how well the actors, like the lawyers, can manipulate the system. Even something as rock solid as DNA, you just attack the kind of the pathology processes down the line, keep on going down the line. Did they collect it in the right way? Did they process in the right? Was it stored correctly? You know, what other kind of things can go wrong? And we're humans, right? Like, think of the trial and the investigation and the trial is just like this giant project, this giant government funded project. There is bound to be something that goes wrong that you can attack, right? And I think that's the case with all this stuff, right? But, you know, one way to look at it is what you've said, which is beyond reasonable doubt. But then the other bit that has really changed, I think, in our time is this idea of innocent until proven guilty. Because come on, like especially when you think about these trial by media, wrongful convictions and all this kind of stuff, like the Amanda Knox thing, it is really like, it doesn't matter because people are just like, where there's smoke, there's fire, and their lives are just ruined. It doesn't matter what the verdict was. And in fact, it's so hard to understand for a layperson what the verdict actually is because, you know, there's like retrials, there's like appeals, there's different courts they go through, there's, you know, civil and all this kind of stuff depending on the country, that it doesn't matter. Like, it's just like the court of public opinion tries you nowadays, right?
Well, I think with like, let's say in a jury, beyond reasonable doubt, in a jury situation, at the end of the day, you just need one juror or a handful of jurors who want to believe that you're innocent. Like they like the person, that person comes across as like a decent chap or fellow. Or
we cannot convict Jack Sparrow in all good conscience.
Like OJ, like he's like it's like an all American hero, right? And if there's like a handful of people who want to believe that he's innocent or she's innocent, and that they've got enough of them that like have bought into the person, and that's probably what most of these cases are trying to do, right? They're trying to sell the person as much as anything else. And then those like pathology reports suddenly have a lot more currency because you can say, see, look, it's just this dodgy pathology report. They didn't get the facts right. See, you can't, So in that jury room, it's like the motivation of what is guiding the conversation has got to be quite different to like, we're not talking about like, a scientific like meeting of peers like coming together like to discuss the evidence. They're they're people who, in fact, that's why they've chosen, right? Because they're everyday, right? People who will have their own prejudices and things. And the judge will say, "No, you can only consider this and that and the other." But what actually motivates people? Again, back to the free will. They can't take that personality or their own biases and sentiments away from that conversation. And to the Amanda Knox kind of innocent until proven guilty, it's that like shadow of doubt, like smoke, there's fire, whether it's like, well, you've been accused of murder, and even though I'm convinced you probably are innocent, I can never be 100% sure. So even if it's just a 1% chance, like I'm 99% sure, that still means there's a 1% chance you're a murderer and you're in this room with me right now.
Yeah.
And like, could you do it again?
Like
Like
some evolutionary psychology right there, right? Like we don't want to wait around for that 1%. The difference between being any percent murderer versus not is like a gulf, right?
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway,
you know what was really sad about making a murderer? It was that scene, that episode where, what was the cousin's name? The younger guy that was attached to him, where the police officers kind of coerced that confession out of him. That was just like seeing that happen before your eyes was just like nothing I've ever seen before. This idea that you can just like, through a combination of psychological techniques and interrogation techniques, you can just lean on someone who is totally ill-equipped to fight back, and you can get what you want with them. Like make them more suggestible over time and just kind of lean on them through pressure and get them to admit to things that they didn't want to. That to me was like, wow, this is like, this is crazy.
I mean, that seems to be a common thread in all of these wrongly accused and even imprisoned sort of cases where they have some sort of an interview and then they get the person to either admit to it or
some incrimination,
some sort of, like something to kind of, and then what they usually say is that, they had me in for like 24 hours and it was just this relentless thing, and then they got me to even question my own
pressure cooker
reality.
And there are people that study this as a psychological kind of condition. But what I find, what really makes your blood boil, is that often at times there are other leads going on in the investigation, and they know potentially it's not this person, but they just put them all under the same pressure to see what comes out. And it's almost like a real estate agent trying to get the lowest offer to get the sale done quickly. I feel like the incentives are all wrong. They just need a conviction. They don't need justice, right? With the way it works. And I know it's not that black and white for everything, but it definitely seems like the incentives of that law enforcement don't lend towards taking the time, because often they're pursuing other leads, or perhaps they have new evidence that leads them down a different road or a different what do they call it? What was the word they call when it's just a different like lead suspect, right? But they don't change tack, like they just double down, like because of whatever it is, and that's the part that just like makes your blood boil.
I mean, this is the beauty of let's say when they offer plea deals or whatever, so they amp up the notion that they think someone's guilty and they've got all the physical evidence to convict them or whatever, and then get them to, okay, well, let's start negotiating and get the actual evident, like the proof part out of the way, and just negotiate on, well, we'll give you a reduced sentence as long as you admit your guilt, right? And I mean, it's hard to know, does that solve the problem? It probably doesn't, because I suppose if you're innocent, it's hard to imagine that you would accept that. Like you'd just have to trust the system, right? That I'm innocent. Like I'm going to be found not guilty. Like how can they find me guilty if I didn't do it? And so you'd think you wouldn't take a plea deal, but then you look at all this stuff that the police are saying and the investigators are saying, and you think, oh, okay, well, maybe if I just accept this, it'll be 5 years instead of 25 years. And gee, I don't know if I want to take the risk on 25 years and then you have a innocent person in jail for 5 years, and then whoever actually did it off, writing love songs with the Manson family.
Yeah, it's incredible. And the Amanda Knox one was a bit of a masterclass in that wrongful conviction and what they put her through. And she had the language barrier to essentially, in Italy, right? And she couldn't really speak, but she could just speak enough to get herself into trouble. And same old thing, like you said, they use the same interrogation techniques to weaken the resolve and prey on this human tendency to want to avoid short-term pain, even if there's going to be long-term issues with that. It's like, I will do whatever you want me to do to get out of this situation that I'm in, because I feel like I'm in danger, I'm threatened, and it's only going to get worse. So I will do whatever I can to get out of it now and fuck tomorrow.
So you've been accused of a crime. We won't say whether you actually committed it or not, and you're facing 25 years in jail. How do you think you'd go with that?
I think all the arguments around free will wouldn't really help me at that point.
Hey, you can start evangelizing in. You'd have all the time in the world to do your philosophy.
Yeah, you could run a pretty sweet podcast. We probably could still do this podcast from jail, right?
You wouldn't have access to internet and all that stuff.
Community service. It's brought back a memory of Matthew Perry, rest in peace. And he has this very famous interview with Hitchens, and he's talking about this idea of like agency. And of course, Perry's he's an alcoholic and he's an addict, and he's saying that, so you're saying that it's my choice to kind of keep on drinking, right? And like having more and more drinks. And Hitchens is like, yes, of course I believe that it's, that's your choice to do that. And he says, well, the first drink is my choice, but not the second, third, fourth, fifth, and then it gets out of control. And yeah, I think a lot of people probably relate to that on a minor level for a lot of things, right? Like perhaps there's a turning point in your night or in your life, and you might have control there, but once you slip there, you're very much down the rabbit hole. If I was going to jail, there would have to be some kind of like psychological training that would have to go into it to prepare yourself for what's to come, and I don't know how much of that would be a level of detachment from your outside life, right? Like obviously you'd have to get your affairs in order and all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, you're leaving that behind, and I guess all the usual anxieties that those relationships won't be there for you when you come back. So I'm not sure what the level of like bolstering and making plans for that would be versus kind of almost detaching from them or letting them go, and this idea of like what will happen, and I can't be in that mindset worrying about them because I won't make it through this period. Now, I think it's very different if you're going in for life versus you're going in for a shorter amount of time that you believe that you still will have a life when you come out. And I think that's one of the biggest indicators of like hope and what it is, right? Like if you're going in for life or whatever, then that's a different story, I think. I think that in terms of preparation, though, I don't think you can do much. I don't think you can, this is not some kind of Happy Gilmore movie where you got to start training, martial arts to protect yourself and get your asshole tattooed or something. Or I think it'd be all mental, and you'd want to surround yourself with as much networks and people you can call from a legal perspective and from a social perspective to get that set up. And yeah, I think that's what I'd be focusing on before you go in. But gee, it would just be, yeah, you can't even really imagine, can you? Have you tried to imagine?
I dream about it every night. So I did say 25 years. So,
well, this thing is 25 years, but then on good behavior, can you be out in 10?
No, this is like under like mandatory sentencing.
Well, at our age, being in for 25, you're pretty much, you've got like probably a good 10 years when you come out.
Well, yeah, so I agree. Like if you're in for 12 months, I think you would just treat it as a, all right, I'm just going to be away for like, a sabbatical or something. What's
this tough as it in your resume between... I just went backpacking.
But like to get your head in a place where you're like, no, this is my life now. I think, well, you mentioned all the things you do before you went in. Well, I suppose, if you probably don't have that much time and headspace to do things before you go to jail anyway. It's not like preparing for an overseas holiday. But I think all the things you've got to do actually inside the jail, like I think you've got to try and build social networks inside. You've got to build a life there. You've got to familiarize yourself with the your other inmates and kind of develop some kind of a social bond with them, maybe show your value to them in some other way so they can be of value to you, both in terms of the prison economy, if you want to put it that way, but also your own sanity as well. Yeah, I mean, like, to the extent that you can, I guess, get lots of books. I don't know what actually privileges are common in prisons, like whether, for example, can you have, like, what's the deal if you want to have access to the internet, like, at all? Like, is it monitored? Like, can you have whatever books you want? I think there's a spectrum of, like, privileges depending on the nature of the prison and your sentence and the nature of your crime. But I don't imagine that they treat the like corporate criminals the same as they do the hard, as in physical violence sort of categories. So,
except for the crypto scammers, they put them in the Supermax.
Yeah, just to watch them. Well, actually, they say, isn't it what they say? The worst thing is to be in isolation. Like, and so sometimes they put high-profile people in isolation just for their own safety, but it's actually like a really bad place to be because you don't get the social connections. But yeah, I mean, have you ever thought, like, is there some aspect about prison that is almost like appealing in that you just don't have any worries anymore? Like, there's just nothing to worry about. It's like a holiday. Like, you just.
I think you. I know you're being joking here, of course, but I think it's like, sometimes when people have mental breakdowns and they go to the hospital and they're pretty much doing it because they need a break from their life, right? And they need to be like in a hospital bed for a while. And it's like this feeling, when you're a kid and you fake being sick, or maybe you do start off sick, but you're not really that sick by the time you miss school. And so you have the best day of your life. You're like, you get to be, your mum takes pity on you. You're like sitting on the couch with a blanket and some sandwiches and some chips and stuff. And the day's just amazing because you don't feel sick anymore and you just have a day off school. I think that's what you're describing, but you can't fake being sick in prison. You are sick. You're in prison. You're in fear for, you're in the idea of, like, you don't have the freedoms that you want. Like, no one can, I don't think we can understand that, this idea that someone tells you what to do all the time. And yes, that could be comforting if you're overwhelmed, but really, like, that loss of freedom is mentally degrading. This idea of, like, I think what you're describing is just like this idea of solitude and this idea of, like, not having responsibility. Again, like, those are good things, but also there are also things that make it probably very hard for people to come back out into this community again.
I think also responsibility and having to do shit is actually what makes your life meaningful. What makes you feel useful. And it's like, I had this thing today where, because it's the holidays, I just sort of, I had the definition of free time. Like, I could have done anything I wanted to do. And
don't talk to me.
I'm just like, I don't know what to do. And so I went out and did some gardening. Like, I just, like,
this is a new low.
Well, when I say gardening, like, I just pulled some weeds out of the garden bed and cleaned it. It's just like, I don't know what to do. Like, I've got nothing else.
This idea of killing time, right? Have you listened to the Serial podcast, by the way?
Is that the Adnan Syed one?
Yeah.
Did he get out?
I haven't followed it for a long time. When I stopped following it, he was still in jail.
I think there was this thing where he got out. So I think he did get out.
I always feel like when they finally get out, it's on such a weird technicality. It's never like they've been proven, they've been exonerated. It's like Form 23A-B was filed incorrectly.
All right. Well,
till next time.